soon. All right. Well, welcome to the TWIJ Show. I'm Chris Wink, your host and the CEO of Technically. We're a news site about local economies and change. Each week, the TWIJ Show is going to dive into topics on the theme of building better companies, and we'll be talking with leaders who are doing just that. We are an extension of Technically's This Week in Jobs newsletter, which you can join at technically/subscribe. Today, we're piloting this thing. And like all interesting things, yes, that's what I need to hear. Like all interesting things, the TWIJ Show is coming out of complete turmoil. In this case, that is a pandemic-caused self-quarantine and an ensuing economic shock. So of course, on this first episode, we're going to be talking about team messaging in crisis. And I'll be doing so with two startup founders whom we at Technically have known and reported on for years. I'm joined by Jess Gartner. She's the CEO and founder of Allovue, an edfintech company that empowers K-12 educators to strategically and equitably allocate financial resources. They're based in Baltimore, Maryland. She's also a great follow on Twitter, I will add. I'm frequently amused by Jess. I also have here my dear friend Bruce Marable, the co-founder and CEO of EmployeeCycle, an HR analytics dashboard. If Technically were to do a yearbook style superlatives, he would probably be in the running for best dressed. So thank you, Jess and Bruce. Thank you for talking messaging team in crisis. How are you guys doing? Maybe better yet, where are you? Let's start with self-quarantine. Jess, what does your self-quarantine bunker look like?
I am in my home office in beautiful Baltimore, Maryland, specifically in the Remington neighborhood of Baltimore.
Shout out.
Which is actually only a block away from our office at our house, which is off limits right now.
So both close and far away in so many ways. Bruce, you in a mountainside of Wyoming or something? Or
of course. You know, I'm in the mountains, just hanging out by the lake. Riding horses.
Yeah.
No, my wife and I were in our apartment. We live at 11th and Spring Garden, so center city-ish.
In beautiful Philadelphia.
Yeah. So we're here, staying in, washing our hands.
That's good. That's good. So crisis can mean a lot of things, and we want to range them, but we happen to be in the middle of a pandemic. So I'm wondering if you guys could start there. How were you first saying the words coronavirus or COVID-19 or pandemic to your teams? Like when and or not even when, how? What means and context was that coming up?
Sure, Jess, you can start.
Sure. So this started unfolding as I was wrapping up basically 8 weeks of travel. I had been on the road since the first week of January. I was spending an average of about 30 waking minutes in my house every week. So this has been a big switch.
Yeah.
And I was actually
hopefully you weren't going through Wuhan and Lombardy, Italy.
I was not.
All right, good.
But I was coming back from California the first week of March, and things were definitely accelerating in California more quickly than they were on the East Coast at that point. So things were being discussed with a little bit more seriousness, but also my dad and I had been at the movies that weekend. It was not yet at a point where anyone was talking about it in terms of lock yourself in your house. And when I got back that Monday, we met with our exec team and said, we should say something about this because something is clearly happening, but we're not sure what this is going to look like yet. So the first thing we did was we sent out a note in our weekly update to the team where we said, for right now, if you can stay home, you should err on the side of doing so. Wash your hands as much as possible. If you feel at all sick, do not come into the office. And we're going to continue to monitor this, and we'll update at least weekly on company policy. So even I started working from home that week. And by that Friday, we said, this is no longer optional. Everyone's working from home now. And then So I think we were a little bit ahead of telling folks to stay home and not come into the office. But since our team is fairly remotely distributed anyway, that was a pretty easy transition for us. We have a very flexible work from home policy to begin with. So it wasn't hard to just say, go stay home and work from there for now. And then obviously things escalated from there. And I can talk a little bit more about that messaging later on as well.
Yeah.
So on our end, excuse me, when this first started, I was actually scheduled to be in San Francisco for the SaaStr conference. And then I was already debating if I was going to go to an HR tech conference in Vegas about 1 or 2 weeks after that. And then right after the conference, my wife and I were scheduled to be at a destination wedding. And so we were just thinking about so many different things from a personal and professional standpoint of should we go, should we not go, what's still going to happen. Interestingly enough, the SaaStr conference, I don't think they canceled the conference until about 4 days before the conference was actually supposed to happen, whereas other people had already been canceling things 2, 3, 6 months in advance. So it was really confusing as to whether or not we should go or not go. If we go, is it silly? Are we putting ourselves in danger? But then are we missing out on an opportunity that otherwise, would have happened anyway? We could have just performed social distancing. And so all of those things were happening from a personal and professional level as well. And in regards to the team, similar to you, Jess, our team is fairly remote. I work from a co-working space in Center City, Philly, and the rest of our team works remote, but we're all local remote. And so everyone is still in the Philly area. We just all work from different places. So for us, that transition didn't really cause any hiccups or didn't really cause any change from a productivity standpoint. And so for me, it was just more about being the CEO, what I saw in this article, the chief empathy officer, and just really kicking in high gear, making sure that everyone was okay, how to manage people's anxiety or stress or confusion or uncertainty around this the best that I could, while I'm also trying to manage it for myself.
Mm-hmm. I look back a little bit at our own timeline to use COVID-19 as an example for other crises like this. I don't think I got this right all the way here. So March 4th, we have Network Baltimore. Network's our tech jobs fair that we hosted technically. We do it in all of our markets. We were in Baltimore. We had like a couple vendors who checked in like at end of February and said, "Hey, are you watching this thing?" There was no advisement at that point. We had similar show rate, maybe a little bit lower show rate than we typically do, but March 4th, we still had a couple hundred people, 20, 25 companies at a jobs fair. And I'm looking at my first staff-wide email Friday, March 6th, in which says, this thing is happening. We don't know if this is going to be enormously disruptive or it won't be as real as it's saying. But we want you guys to take caution. If you're not feeling well, don't come to the office. But for the moment, we're going right ahead. We had Network DC, the DC version of that coming up at that point was going to be March 20th. That was still at that point happening. Then into the week of March 9th, that's when things changed. We also have, like most web firms, we had a fairly flexible work from home policy. We had a couple team members who were already they were ahead of it before I was. I remember I had a teammate who really pushed me on, should we be being more aggressive as a company? I said, I hear you. We're, trying to encourage this. At that point, we canceled Network DC. So I was like, we were already canceling events, and we host a thing called Philly Tech Week. Our 10th annual was the first week in May. We were having live conversations then. And then that week is when everything changed from March 9th to me being like feeling it out. We had 20 startup founders at a dinner we hosted on Wednesday, March 11th. And the advisement had just come out that under 50 people was still okay. My wife and I had dinner with friends Thursday. I had drinks with a friend Friday that 13th. That Friday the 13th, that afternoon, I gave the we are working from home mandatory for at least the next 2 weeks, because I didn't know at that point And I, with drinks with that friend or that client, actually was a client that Friday, I said, this might be the last time we're in a restaurant for a while. And that was the last time I've been in a restaurant. So Jess, you had said you talked a little bit about messaging. Yeah. What was, how, and what did that look like when you began messaging this, the world's changing really quickly?
Yeah, I agree. That week, I think between March 4th and the following Friday is when things really escalated in terms of messaging in the US. I mean, I was at a conference March 4th and 5th in California.
Right.
I mean, there were hundreds of people there, and people were kind of doing like the elbow tap greeting, but other than that, like, people weren't really taking it seriously yet. And then most people were on work from home lockdown within a week. So that week, things really escalated quickly. And that was the point where I said, we have to really do much more serious messaging about this the following week. So I hunkered down that weekend, basically like the 12th through the 14th, 15th. I buried myself in the house and came up with like a 30-step plan of various scenarios for how this was going to unfold. I have the ability to completely catastrophize, but also be a pure optimist. So there were a lot of scenarios, and the ends of the spectrum were very far apart. So I came in on Monday. I rolled out the multi-step plan with my leadership team Monday morning on the 16th. And then we called an all hands meeting on the afternoon of the 16th. And I shared in broad buckets. I think I narrowed my 30 steps into like 4 big buckets of categories of plans. And I shared all of it out in pretty significant detail with the team, because I personally am a person who loves information. I do not like gaps in information, and I do not like uncertainty. So, being a startup founder was an awesome choice for me, where basically everything is pure uncertainty all the time. And this is like uncertainty to the extreme. But to counteract that, I am a planner, and I make lists and plans and run multiple scenarios. And I feel comforted by that, by having multiple plans laid out for different scenarios. And I felt it would bring comfort to my team to share that. I think in scenarios of crisis, it can be tempting to withhold information until you know the answers, because I think there's an assumption that people will not be receptive to that shared uncertainty, right? And there's an assumption that you should hold off on sharing until you know it's going to be plan A or it's going to be plan N, and this is what we're going to do. And I think in times of crisis, it actually is much more comforting to share that range of options with people, so that they know there are a range of options. Because for most people, in the absence of knowing what those options are, or that there are plans in place, they will assume the worst. Mm-hmm. Right? The average human response is to speculate and assume the very worst. And particularly in a climate where every day the front page of every paper is reporting layoffs by the millions every week, people will assume the worst. And so I think this is a scenario where, whether it's good news or bad news, or I don't know, even saying, here's the things I know, here's the things I don't know yet, and here's when I think we'll know, I think gives people some peace of mind to know that you are thinking through these different scenarios as a leader. Because for all they know, I'm gonna lay off the whole team tomorrow, or we're good for the next 3 years, right? Unless you're sharing, here's the range of scenarios, they're going to make their own assumptions, and neither of them will be really healthy. So I think in scenarios of crisis, it really helps to over communicate and share as many details about the plans that you're thinking through as possible.
And Bruce, I know I've not always gotten that right in both directions. I've had times when I've walked away and folks like, oh, we're fucked. And I was like, oh no, that wasn't what I was trying to say. Or walked away and said, oh, everything's good. And I was like, no, what? No, that's not what I was saying. So I mean, yeah, Bruce, have you gotten it wrong? Are there like frames of reference you got to give yourself when you're like, I'm about to tell people that something's fucked up, whatever it is, pandemic or whatever. Is there what frame of reference what frame of mind you're trying to be in when you're like, I'm about to say things are fucked up?
Absolutely. So it was interesting listening to the process that you went through, Jess. Mine was very similar, but also a little different. The first week, I just spent figuring out what the hell was going on. And so probably very similar to everyone else. It was a shit ton of Zoom calls and phone calls about, hey, what's going on? What do you think? What's going on? What do you think? Investors, advisors, a whole bunch of people really just trying to figure out, what is this thing? Are we overreacting? Are we not reacting enough? And I was watching the news way too much.
Yeah.
Way too much. And I'm not even a news junkie.
On behalf of the news media, that you can never watch, read, or consume too much, but no.
it was too much, and it was to a point where I believe it was unhealthy during that week, because I just needed to know what was the next thing that was going to happen. And so the first thing that I had to do was unplug and come out of it and say, you know what, fuck the news. I'm turning this off for the weekend. I went to the store and I actually bought a standing boxing punching bag. I went down to our gym. I went down to our gym in our apartment building, and I asked them if I could take the weights, because I knew that they were closing the gym. And I also bought some video game system. And I said, you know what? This is what I'm going to do all day Saturday and Sunday, to clear my mind and then figure out what the hell we were going to do. And that really gave me the space to not think about all the cases, all the deaths, the economy spiraling out of control, and say, you know what is going on here? That helped so much. I came back that Monday, and then that's when I went into wartime mode of, all right, how do we survive? How do we thrive is what people are saying. And most importantly, like, how do we just get through this thing with everything isn't as much of a tact as it possibly can be, whether we are with one arm hanging off, bruised, 2 black eyes, as long as we're still standing. That's all I could think about. And so once I wanted to get my mindset around that framework, that's what I came to the team with. And I said, look, this may suck really bad, more so than what I'm even saying it will now. Clearly, I don't have all the answers, because no one has all the answers. But what I do believe is that this is going to be a very bad situation for a lot of people, and a lot of companies are going to go under. We cannot, will not, should not be one of those companies. So let's make sure that we're doing everything we possibly can do as quickly as possible to make sure that we're in the best position to be able to ride this out as long as possible. So the first thing I did was went to the team and said, okay, based off of our burn, let's cut that 50%. Let's see if there's software that we could cut that we're not using. Are there things that we were planning on doing that we probably shouldn't do now? How do we look at the market in regards to how our product is being perceived, and what kind of value proposition did people see before? I was reading articles saying that if you had product market fit before, you probably don't have product market fit now. And what is the new product market fit? So one of the first things I did to really get a pulse, and I was doing 2 things in tandem. First, I wanted to get a read on what the market was saying. And when I say the market, I'm talking about our customers and prospective customers. And then I also wanted to talk to investors to see what they were saying, so that I could come back, again, as you were saying, Jess, with as much information to the team as possible. So on the customer side, I pivoted our podcast to not just be about generic HR topics, but to be all about how to reduce employee stress and anxiety around coronavirus, which gave me a backdoor way to be mission critical to HR leaders as they are frontline essential people for their team, helping them with getting through all the changes. And that really gave me an understanding of what they were doing, how they were freezing budgets, how all they cared about in real time and still care about right now are how do we make sure that our employees are safe? How do we make sure that they're in a good space mentally, physically? How do we better understand what they need? How do we better understand what their mindset is? And then that's step one. And then step two is figure it out from there. So I clearly understood very quickly that people weren't just buying one nice to haves or even things that could help them do certain things in the ways that we were positioning our product before. It was really now all about how do we cut costs? And if you're not directly impacting how we manage our employees right now, then it's not something that we're interested in talking about for the foreseeable future. So understanding that, I could go back to our team, which is mostly made up of product people, and say, okay, this is what I'm hearing. This is the best plan we can possibly come up with in regards to making sure that we're filling that hole and serving customers the best way we can, whether they're paying for it or not in real time. That's a whole nother conversation, but really, how can we provide the most value with the product that we have, or what can we potentially do to be able to change certain things so that we are as best positioned as possible to provide value.
A couple of themes I want to call out there and see, Jess, if they're resonant with you, that run the gamut of any crisis, pandemic, financial, personal to one organizations or otherwise. You know, Bruce, I heard you say, I got as much information as I could for a discrete period of time before I decided any more information was just going to create more noise. And so I had to constrain. Then I created the best version of an updated plan, willing to let go of what we had been doing quickly and tried to focus my attention on what was most mission critical and was responsive for how that changed. And then communicated the theme of our chat here, communicated to your team, this is the clearest sense I have as quickly as I can. And oh, by the way, it might get updated a whole bunch depending on what and how this happens.
Exactly.
That probably strikes me as like that would be true if you were talking about, you know, layoffs, recession, you know, death or loss of someone, you know. Jess, is that like some of that check for you?
Yeah, and I think the other really important component here across any scenario like this is just to remember that these people that you are working with and trying to lead through these scenarios also have lives and other areas of their life that are impacted beyond the company. And, you know, particularly in this scenario, worrying about the health and job security of people's spouses, children, parents, extended families, you know, life goes on outside of work. And I think even as you're evaluating these scenarios and talking about the impact to the company, I think it's so important to also acknowledge the impact to people's lives. I mean, we have a number of our employees have children who are now home all day with them. You are just kidding yourself if you think that's not going to impact people's work, right? If you now have a toddler running around the house all day who's trying to do Zoom preschool calls, that is a very different scenario than we were in 2 weeks ago. And so I have also stressed along with the company plans, I have really tried to stress the importance of people taking the time that they need to take care of themselves, whether that means you take a break in the middle of the day and go for a walk while it's nice outside, you take extra time to exercise in the morning, you take a few hours in the middle of the day to do a craft with your kids, and maybe you come back later. We set the expectation that these are not normal circumstances, and we don't expect normal productivity and levels of work behavior here, because that's just not realistic. And so we've also tried to make some accommodations for helping people grapple with new challenges for childcare and homeschooling. We've been sharing some educational resources. We've got a lot of former teachers on our team who had access to resources to kind of help with parents, but also just trying to be aware of some other extenuating circumstances in people's lives. Like, are you the sole caretaker for a parent or another elderly relative? And so one thing we did was, in addition to the company-wide messaging, I also personally reached out to every employee to try to get a sense of if there were specific extenuating circumstances in their lives that might require some additional accommodations with scheduling or workload or PTO. And then we've also had all of our managers doing extra check-ins with people on that front too. And, you know, I think there's a certain type of person that goes to work for a startup, and they tend to be people who put a lot of pressure on themselves to perform. And we have tried to emphasize that they should not hold themselves to their same normal standards, because these are not normal circumstances. And we've tried to say, like, if you need permission to give yourself a little grace here, please take it. Like, we are not expecting people to operate at 100% of normal capacity with everything else that's going on in the world. And I think any business leaders that are trying to force normal work expectations on people right now are just setting themselves up for disappointment, because that's just not realistic.
And one of the things you said earlier, Chris, was saying, have you said something that was not taken the way that you wanted it to be, whether it was better or worse than intended? It's interesting that you said that, because as I was speaking to, you know, a person on our team, and I was telling him the plan and telling him how bad I think it could get, but at the same time showing some hope and optimism, the response was overly optimistic to me from what I thought I was going to get. And it was, oh yeah, you've done such a good job of leading the ship, and you know, we've had tough times before, and you've made stuff happen, and you've been great with fundraising and sales and blah blah blah. I'm sure, you know, you'll figure it out when we get through it. I'm like, oh, okay. Well then, yeah, yes. Yeah, so it's interesting where you need to be. The three words that I keep reminding myself to show and how I'm talking to people and managing communication is, first start with, and I think this applies when you're dealing with any type of crisis in general, first start with empathy, as you were saying, Jess. Really understand and empathize with where people are, and then show gratitude and for you not being in the worst situation, because regardless of how bad it is in any crisis, it probably could be worse from a personal and professional standpoint. In this specific COVID situation, it could be worse because, not to be grim, but you could be dead. That's worst case scenario, like as a real worst case scenario, where in 2008, worst case scenario is you go broke. COVID, worst case scenario is you die as a person, which is sad. And so empathy, then move to gratitude, then move to focus. And so the way I like to manage it is, you know, are you okay? I'm going through the same thing. Okay. Thank you so much for still working and doing what you're doing and pushing through. And then, all right, focus. Here are the goals and the milestones that we're still looking to hit, so that we can make sure that our company, you know, still exists. And we're not one of the companies that will fold during this time. And try to start every single conversation in email with that, you know, empathy, gratitude, and then move the focus.
That's those value words are great. In the tail end of our conversation, I want to move to how transferable our lessons are across different organizations. And actually, maybe as a segue point, hearing both of you talk about empathy, of course, is resonant. Whenever I've had to share anything that felt, challenging, we had, a time I fired a long-time employee, or done other firings. Something didn't go the way we wanted to. We had an economic slowdown. We lost client X. We are entering a pandemic. Whenever I've had to say that, one, I guess, a moment of time, I try to always make those in person. That's not a thing that's possible right now. So when the follow-up comes in email, or when I'm preparing notes, the only time I ever really prepare notes for something to the team is like a moment when I want to make sure I try to strike that balance between not too optimistic but not too pessimistic. I try to run through my language as if I was teammate X or teammate Y and their specific, very unique circumstance, because of course all of us understandably say, well, how would this impact my team, my life, my perspective? And that's always been a really great exercise for me, because really often when I'm writing those notes and I suddenly think of myself being person X, I'm like, ooh, that doesn't land great for me, or I see that differently than this other person would do, or I feel a lot more advantaged by what the CEO just said, as opposed to this person feels like I'm way more vulnerable now. So it's pushed me a bunch. I wonder if that's an exercise you guys have done, and maybe even more to the point, is that something that you can only do as a startup founder when you are, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 40 people, and you can still pretty much know everyone, and that gets really challenging the more you grow? Or should you always be able to do that, whether you're, Jamie Dimon or a 50-person startup founder?
So it's interesting. I mentioned the podcast earlier, how I'm interviewing HR leaders about reducing stress and anxiety during this time. And I'm getting a lot of different responses based off of whether the HR leader is at a company with 50 or 100 employees versus 700 or 1,000 employees. And one of the questions that I asked a guest who had, I believe, 700 or 800 employees is, how are you doing the types of fun things? And this will, in a roundabout way, go into your question. How are you doing those fun things like virtual happy hours and other things that people are doing at smaller companies? And she said, well, we can't do that company-wide, obviously, with 700 or 800 people. And what that told me is they have to come up with more policy, procedural, protocol messaging, real messaging about, and more generalized messaging across the board. And what they're doing is trying to allow and provide autonomy to managers or department heads to then have those more deep and careful and curated conversations where they can get more personal. Because at the top, with that amount of employees, you don't even know who all the people are. And you might not even be aware of every single role that people even have and how many people are working from home or not. And so we see companies doing surveys to try to help understand what people are doing and where are they mentally and what they need and how they're feeling. But even with the survey is only giving you a generalized representation of what most or the average of what your workforce is doing. And so I see at a larger point, it's going to be more generalized and boilerplate. And you're going to say, you know what, if 80% of the people agree with this and they're not rubbed the wrong way, but 20% of people are, then that's where you try to have those one-on-one conversations. But, being in journalism, there's no way you can put out an article and 100% of the people read that article the same way. There are always going to be some people that are pissed off or misinterpret whatever the journalist wrote. So I think you definitely have an advantage as a small company right now to be able to make it more personalized and customized and really have that, personal employee experience where you might know a lot more about each individual employee as well. So you know how to tailor the communication versus it being a large company and you're just sending out a press release to 1,000 or 10,000 or 50,000 people saying, hey, this is what we're doing. Or in larger companies, you might find out what your company is doing on the news faster than you actually find out internally, because that's how quickly things are happening.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this when I was doing one-on-one reach outs with my team. I was thinking how grateful I was that I was able to do that. And I was wondering, at what point I would have decided it was too many people. Like right now we're about 40 people. Is it 75? Is it 100? Is it 200? I mean, it took me pretty much the entire day to talk to everyone. But I do think empathy and leading with empathy is absolutely scalable, because those things do start with at the top, and they trickle down to whatever your hierarchy looks like. So I think if you are a 700-person company, probably the CEO can't talk to every single employee, but everybody's manager could talk to them, right? The CEO could say, every manager needs to reach out. And frankly, that probably is more meaningful because that's the person that you're reporting to and interacting with the most. Whereas at that point, they might not even know who you are. So I think that you certainly can scale those same concepts and intentions, right? Maybe you can't get every employee on a virtual happy hour, but you could do them by team, right? You could do them by functional areas. You could make it a game and say, we're going to get to know people, and have a happy hour with people we don't normally interact with. So I think the spirit of those values can absolutely be scaled. And I see it in what I'm seeing on, whether it's news or Twitter. It's very obvious to me which leaders are thinking about their staff of any size as human beings who are living in this crazy time right now, versus leaders who are thinking about people as lines on a spreadsheet. To me, it is abundantly apparent as a casual observer, the value systems of leaders and CEOs. And so I absolutely think that in either direction, those things can scale and trickle down.
We're right at time. That's a wonderful sentiment to lead us out of. But I wonder, to take us fully out, what's that? Put again with our theme, messaging through crisis. Is there that most crystallized point, takeaway lesson that you would want to share with others, or you want to hold yourself to? What's that like most grounding point in this concept of how to message well to a team during crisis?
For me, if you're a leader, I think you have to make room for yourself to be able to critically think about it in the shortest period of time. I mean, the way that I think about it, I'm a chess player and I play speed chess, and it's a totally different game when you're playing a game of chess in 2 or 5 minutes than if you're playing in a competition where the game might be an hour or 2 hours long. And so for me, it's about how do I play speed chess and think as critically and make the best move, like make my next move the best move every single time, but also in the shortest period of time. And so I need laser focus. And the only way I can do that is to be in a mental place and a clear mindset to be able to think strategically, but also very quickly. Because if I take too long to make moves, then we'll run out of time. So I think you just need to make sure that you're doing whatever, and maybe that's yoga, maybe it's, you're leaning on your faith, maybe it's jogging, whatever you need to do, just remove yourself from the situation and give yourself some room to breathe and think clearly about what you're doing, because you probably won't have that amount of time. You won't have that much time to make a decision, and you don't want to regret the decision that you made, because it could, could end your company or do something else drastic to, whatever your situation.
Yeah. To me, pretty simply, it's treating my employees the way I would want to be treated, and really thinking through what I would want from a leader right now and what I would need to hear to feel safe and respected, and doing everything I can to treat my team the way that I would want to be treated and the way I would want to receive information, if the roles were reversed.
I love both of those. Something that resonates with me also is I think a lot about balancing, maximizing transparency with when that ceases to be productive. And that is, that's a lesson that I'm still grappling with. My instinct, both like reporter by trade, as I grew a small team, was always, well, of course, all the information is the best information. And I really grappled with how that's not true, particularly if it's changing a lot, or it wouldn't or can't change behavior, and then it's just needless stress or strain. That's something that I've thought a lot about with when messaging through crisis. Yes, maximize transparency, but when you chart out transparency, at some point you get diminishing returns when it ceases to be able to actually inform behavior. And that's something that I am probably saying out loud as much for me as anyone, that you have to balance that. Well, Jess, Bruce, this is the pilot of the TWIJ Show. Thank you so much for being part of it. Indeed. Thanks, guys. First, I'm going to stop recording, which I know how to do, I swear.
It's okay. It's the pilot. Now we can have the blooper reel.